Hey everybody, welcome into the back room. I'm Andy Ostroy. We have an exciting new guest for you today, Jennifer Rodgers, former federal prosecutor, and we're going to talk all things Trump. But first, thank you for tuning in. We appreciate you listening, and we'd love to hear your comments. So email us at backroomandy@gmail.com and or post on our social media, and we'll read some feedback next time. And if you like the podcast, please follow or subscribe and rate and review, and you'll be notified every time we post a new episode. Here's some feedback we received this week. On our conversation with Rachel Bidekoffer, Shelley Frost writes, Andy, how many ways can I thank you for introducing me to Rachel? Like you said to her during your interview, she is so easy to understand, and she should be paid by the DNC for her brilliance in how to win this election. I will subscribe to her wherever I find her. Jeff Mende writes, loved your episode with Rachel Bidekoffer. She is awesome. She is someone I seek out daily in my podcast searches. I believe in her. She is a gem. On our conversation with White House photographer Pete Souza, Kathy Watkowski writes, I love Mr. Souza's work during the Obama administration. Beautiful moments captured forever. God, how I miss them. Very interesting conversation there, too. Thank you. And Barbara Persnowski writes, Pete speaks the truth. He is also darn good at Wordle. All right, let's get to our two big things.
We're going to put a 100% tariff on every single car that comes across the line, and you're not going to be able to sell those cars. If I get elected, now if I don't get elected, it's going to be a bloodbath for the whole, that's going to be the least of it. It's going to be a bloodbath for the country. That'll be the least of it.
All right, so that caused a whole shitstorm because, as we know, Donald Trump has said things like that many, 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 many times, but he and his sycophantic aides have been trying to walk that back since, saying that it was all about the auto industry. He actually said it's going to be a bloodbath for the country. Those were his exact words.
The country of Detroit, apparently.
The inner city Detroit,
right.
Specifically. We know what he was doing. We know what he was doing.
I'm just surprised that they even pushed back on it because they usually buy into his crazy. I mean, why not just say he meant bloodbath for the country?
That's a good point because he never really walks back anything. It's because he's speaking to a base that doesn't want him to walk anything
exactly.
back.
So why even?
That's a good point.
Yeah, but that was at his Ohio rally, and he also made some other incredibly bizarre, outrageous statements, such as,
You see the spirit from the hostages, and that's what they are, as hostages. They've been treated terribly and very unfairly, and you know that, and everybody knows that. And we're going to be working on that soon. The first day we get into office, we're going to save our country. We're going to work with the people to treat those unbelievable patriots, and they were unbelievable patriots and are.
I mean, come on, can a Trump-jacketed man violently storm the Capitol, beat the shit out of cops, take a giant shit in Nancy Pelosi's office, and not have to deal with this kind of unfair treatment?
Don't you think, though, that this would resonate more deeply with the electorate as opposed to just being like, my God, just stop talking. Let's just move on. I mean, it's
Yes.
scary.
Well, he's invigorating half the country and totally fucking exhausting the other half.
One thing to remember, though, is that the overwhelming majority of Republicans believe that he won the election. You know, and they might even excuse that by saying, oh, there were a few bad apples in that bunch, but the majority of them were just doing patriotic things.
No, I agree with that. I've been saying that when you believe that your president was robbed and you had an election stolen from you, then you are a patriot.
Sure.
All right, we have another clip here from Ohio.
Wide, we're leading in every single swing state against Biden, in the largest margins ever. You know, it was interesting. Joe Biden won against Barack Hussein Obama. Has anyone ever heard of him? Barack Hussein Obama, every swing state, Biden beat Obama. But every other state, he got killed. You think that's an honest election?
It's actually a non-existent election because Joe Biden never ran against Barack Obama. I mean, this guy says shit like this all the time, and everyone just obsesses on Joe Biden.
Who needs a detail-oriented president? That's just bullshit.
True, Jen.
it doesn't matter. That's the crazy part. It really doesn't matter. I mean, we'll play it here. They'll play it on MSNBC. You'll read about it in the New York Times. And everything is so siloed that this fact that he is completely off his, I mean, it's dementia at this point.
Well, we have a big day coming up on Monday. He has to come up with $454 million, $464 million plus interest, I believe. So far, he can't come up with the money. 30 financial institutions turned him down. There was an interesting thing that I heard Claire McCaskill say, which was the idea that no one will take his real estate as collateral ought to tell you something about whether or not he overvalued his real estate or not. That's kudos to Claire McCaskill. The issue is also, like, how much of those buildings does he own?
Well, that's a big part. I
how,
mean, you can't.
How leveraged is he?
Yes.
That's what's really going to hurt him, I think.
Yeah.
On the flip side, there are ways he may be able to come up with this money.
Sure.
And
don't look at me because I said, talking to Don Lemon that I'm not loaning him. I'm not loaning him any money.
I mean, Musk is one billionaire that could give him the money somehow, but there's others too. One thing he might do is just find a right billionaire to give the vice presidency to. There's also significant talk about Truth Social going public and him getting $3 billion windfall from it.
Yeah, that's so they're voting on that today.
And even though that would take months for them to do that, he could go to the courts and show, something. And there are ways he could not delay her putting a lien on. There's no doubt, I think, that by Tuesday morning, there'll be some liens on something. But, there is this fantasy of Trump Tower being, renamed Letitia James Tower. That's not going to happen. They're not going to actually take possession of anything anytime soon.
Liberals have a fantasy of seeing a clip of Letitia James walking out of her office building with like a big gold chain, like taking an Uber up to Trump Tower, just like
the crane and the sign,
padlocking the front door, kicking out the tenants.
Yes.
And that ain't going to happen. It's a very complicated process to freeze and seize the assets. And so Monday is going to be a really, really interesting day. He also had a fun week with Jews. Jews.
Maybe he wants to be on Jew too.
If you're a Jew and you vote Democrat, you should be ashamed of yourself because you hate Israel. As a Jew, I say, fuck you, Donald Trump. Don't you fucking dare tell me what I am or who I should support and what kind of Jew I am or aren't. He's a fucking Nazi. Guy supports Nazis. Eats dinner with Nazis. And he's telling me what kind of Jew I should be? Fuck him.
It went from crazy and scary and like horrifying to noise to now normal.
Yeah, well, it's like the old expression, boys will be boys, right? So he's a corrupt, pathologically lying traitor who hates Jews, gays, women,
and a rapist,
immigrants, and he rapes women. But that's Trump. That's Trump. But we like his policies. I wonder what policies they're referring to when they say that. I like his policies. And Judge Cannon. Oh, Aileen. Come on, Aileen. Oh, what are you? What the fuck?
You have expectations that she's better than anything other than terrible, and that's why you're disappointed.
Yes.
No, she is just, I don't know. Thank you, Judge Cannon, for bringing the words writ of mandamus into my vocabulary. It's the new hanging chad.
Oh, yeah.
I did not check that this morning.
For those of you who don't know what a writ of mandamus is, it might be filed in a case where a judge has a personal connection to a case or its participants, but refuses to remove themselves from the case. The mandamus would be asking the higher court to compel the lower court judge to appoint another judge to the case. This is an option special counsel Jack Smith might have. And the problem with all her craziness with like this jury instruction, which to make a very, very long story short, she basically said to the jury, because of the Presidential Records Act, he can take whatever he wants. So knowing that he can take whatever he wants, you cannot convict him. That's kind of what she said.
Yep.
And it's fucking insane. And so if Jack Smith waits to go to trial and something happens, like there's like double jeopardy. You can't, like, if the jury acquits and then you file some shit, like, you can't. He has to act now. He has to stop this nonsense, is insanity, but before that trial begins, whenever it begins. So he has to do something. And this writ of mandamus. Mandamus.
Mandamus.
Oh no, not the mandamus. All right, the election. It's creeping up on us. But Stuart Stevens, who we've had on before and we've got to have on again soon, this is what he thinks.
My image of the Trump campaign is somebody walking around with a paper bag full of water. I don't think it's going to leak, but I think when this thing goes, it's going to go quickly. And I think there's a good chance that we're going to have a situation like 1980 in reverse, where Carter was tight with Reagan until the middle of October, and then kind of the bottom fell out for Carter.
Now, for those of you perhaps not familiar with Stuart Stevens, he's been a Republican operative strategist for decades. The guy knows his shit. And I like what he just said, because I agree with it 100%. And I've been saying this for weeks now. Just don't pay attention to the noise. Just focus on reality. And the reality is Democrats have won every major election, every key critical election in the last several years. Donald Trump is a sociopath who's been indicted 4 times on 91 felony counts, 2 impeachments. He is a rapist. Didn't win last time. I don't really know how he's going to win this time. Trump has no money. His campaign is running out of cash. The RNC is broken. It is now controlled by his daughter-in-law. Okay? Joe Biden is pulling in money like no one has ever before. And the interesting thing is, when people start paying attention, come Labor Day, September, October, and Joe Biden has been not only running ads like crazy for the last several months, but in those 2 months has a war chest to blitz this country with advertising. And Donald Trump is broke, and his campaign is broke. I mean, they just released a new ad. I don't know if you saw it, but it's not an ad for Joe Biden. It's an ad for Trump, of Trump. It's all about the bleach. It's all about this. It's like, remember this, folks? Remember this? Is this what you want 4 more years of? And so I'm telling you, those last 2 months, when people do start to pay attention, you're going to see 2 very different campaigns.
Okay. I hope so.
This would be the part where you go like, I want to be in Andy's optimistic head.
I mean, I said that last week,
not
so
me,
I didn't want to
baby.
be
It ain't
redundant.
me, baby. It's Stuart Stevens. I'm with Stu.
Okay.
Hope so.
All right, let's get to our winners and losers.
My winner, Purim. The only happy Jewish holiday I'm aware of is this weekend. So while you're enjoying your Hamantaschen, I just want you to remember this fun fact. Some say the cookie resembles a vulva to represent Queen Esther's fertility. You're welcome.
Wait, did you just marry Purim and vaginas?
I did.
Wow.
Well,
Okay.
got to keep you guys on your toes.
Keeping it real.
Yep. My loser, SCOTUS and Texas. I've had it with the immigration situation, capped off this week with the Texas migrant arrest law.
Okay, so I'm going to go with my loser first, and that's just simply the doomed Republican impeachment inquiry, which is completely fallen apart. And now they're trying to hint at, well, the election will determine the impeachment of Joe Biden. And my winner is the Department of Justice and 16 states that filed an antitrust case against Apple. I love my Apple products, but they are definitely conducting an unfair monopolistic operation, and it's about time that they deal with this situation.
My winner, Stormy Daniels, whose new Netflix documentary is out, and she is thriving while her old nemesis, Donald Trump's life is in shambles. My loser, the state of Texas, which seems hell-bent on being the most racist state in the country. All right, it's time for the weekly rant. This coming Monday, Donald Trump will have to come up with an appeal bond of nearly $500 million or face New York's Attorney General Letitia James freezing and seizing his assets to pay his judgment in the state's civil fraud case. I've been going back and forth in my head with a critical question. Would I rather see Donald Trump broke or wearing an orange jumpsuit? Now, don't get me wrong. I can't stand this despicably corrupt, treasonous sociopath. And I'd love to see his maggot-infested soul rot in prison for the rest of his miserable life. But there's a huge part of me that believes the worst punishment for him is to fuck with his money, to freeze and seize his assets, sell his properties, and shatter once and for all the myth that he's a wealthy, successful, billionaire businessman. Trump's entire identity, his entire self-worth, his brand, every fucking thing about him revolves around that myth. And the stakes are even higher for him now politically as he desperately seeks another shot at the Oval Office. Not because he's a patriot who loves his country and wants to selflessly serve it, but rather because it's his only safe haven, because if he wins in November, he will destroy the Department of Justice's independence, shut down his federal criminal trials, and weaponize the Department of Justice against his enemies. So, being a broke-ass fraud, a pretend billionaire, who loses, for example, his prized possessions such as Trump Tower, 40 Wall Street, Mar-a-Lago, and or his New York and New Jersey golf clubs because he doesn't have the money to pay the judgment, when his political career since 2015 has been entirely founded on his promise to run the country like a successful business, could very well, in his eyes, cost him the election. And he's right. I'm not going to lie. I can't wait for Monday. All right, let's bring out Jennifer Rodgers. She is a lecturer in law at Columbia Law School, an adjunct professor of clinical law at the NYU School of Law, and a legal analyst for CNN. She teaches, writes, and speaks about government ethics, public corruption, sports corruption, and criminal law issues. Between 2000 and 2013, Jennifer worked at the United States Attorney's Office for the Southern District of New York, where she served in numerous capabilities, including as a Deputy Chief Appellate Attorney, the Chief of the Organized Crime Unit, and a Chief of the General Crimes Unit. She serves on the Board of Directors for the New York City Bar Association. Jennifer, welcome into the back room.
Thanks for having me.
So I want to start off with a macro question, which may actually end up being more rhetorical than anything else. But as someone who spent about 14 years or so as a federal prosecutor, is it just astounding to you how many different criminal indictments and trials a former U.S. president and current Republican presidential nominee is facing? I mean, in your lifetime, could you have ever imagined a scenario like this?
No, of course not. But, I couldn't have imagined a scenario in which Donald Trump would win the presidency, right? So got to go back to basics on that one. But no, of course not. I mean, the president has always been, if not a perfect person, someone who you at least expect will stay within the confines of criminal law, which is, not that hard to do, to be honest.
Mm-hmm.
So I certainly never thought that a president would end up, I guess in theory you could see you got a bad seat and ends up charged with, a corruption offense or one thing, but the breadth of charges, right? Because we're not talking about the same facts in 4 different jurisdictions. There's a lot of overlap in the federal election subversion case with the Georgia case, but the Manhattan DA case is a wholly separate animal,
Mm-hmm.
and so is the classified documents case. So really, even if you say just 3 completely different factual scenarios being criminally charged against a president, certainly I think no one anticipated that. If they did, we all would have said that they were crazy,
Mm-hmm.
and yet here we are.
Mm-hmm. And it would seem likely that this is all the stuff we know about, but like someone who has acted so brazenly, criminally, to me just smacks of a lifetime of absolute corruption. How did he slip through the system to make it into the Oval Office? Like, that is just insane to me.
Yeah. Well, there have been investigations, of course, in the past. We
Mhm.
know of a criminal investigation in Manhattan around real estate practices. The Times expose about his taxes was nuts. All of that is
Right.
well beyond the statute of limitations. But he's been in constant back and forth with tax authorities for decades. And that expose was really something about the wealth transfer between his father and him and some of his siblings. I guess he cheated at least one of his siblings out of some of it. But, there's clearly been a lot of illegality. But when you're really wealthy, and one characteristic of Trump that has come to really impact all of these cases that we're talking about is his willingness to litigate to death, right? To overwhelm his potential opponents with litigation. And sometimes it's, a contractor comes because Trump refuses to pay him, and he's like, I'll give you 10 cents on the dollar. If you litigate against me, I'll bury you and it'll cost you more than you would have made, et cetera.
Right.
And win that way. But he also has sort of done the same with even the government, like in tax matters, right? The IRS says, oh, you might owe us more. And he brings in the lawyers, and, soon is going to be this massive battle. Say, okay, we'll take the 15 cents on the dollar or what have you. Like, his strategy of scorched earth negotiation / litigation is kind of a characteristic of his and has helped him, as I'm sure we'll talk about, certainly in these criminal cases, but across the board. That has been something he's known for, and it has worked.
Yeah. All my life, I've really believed in the Constitution, that the rule of law was rock solid. I believe in our judicial system. But for all the reasons you just gave, it's starting to appear like the founding fathers never could prepare for someone like Trump, that our rule of law is being taxed so much because of the relentless litigation. He is just so criminally active that it's exhausting not just us, but the system, right? It exhausts the system. And it just seems like the system isn't holding up because he has successfully understood that if you just come at it like with this barrage of suits and motions and appeals all over the country, like, you can't keep up with him. And I wonder if he's ever going to truly be held accountable.
Yeah, well, those are two separate thoughts, right? I mean, on the first one, it definitely is taxing the system, and it's always a balance, right? You do want to hold people accountable when they've done wrong, but the reason that justice moves so slowly, especially criminal justice, is, you want to be careful not to harm the people who haven't done wrong, and so it does take time, and I think it's so frustrating for some people. But this is the balance that we've struck as we try to weed out the cases that shouldn't be brought and should be overturned and so on. And so, that kind of is what it is. At least the judicial system is holding up, albeit very, very slowly. And we can talk separately about what the Supreme Court is doing, if you want. Yeah, I mean, that. Is he ever going to be held accountable? That's another interesting question. It kind of depends on what you mean. If you mean, will these cases go through to their conclusion? And if they result in convictions, will he be a convicted felon? That is going to depend, except for perhaps in the Manhattan case, on the election, right? For reasons we can talk about. But if you mean, is he ever going to prison? Are we ever going to see Donald J. Trump, in an orange jumpsuit somewhere? I suspect probably not. Even if he is convicted in one or more of these cases. So I guess it just depends on what accountability means. But if that is true, if he is convicted and yet doesn't go to prison, then I guess that will be okay within our system, right? Because that will mean that a judge has decided, which is part of the system, that whether it's because of the offenses, which in the Manhattan case maybe aren't serious enough to warrant prison time, or whether because of his age, health, all sorts of things, he doesn't warrant prison time. President Biden in a second term might pardon him. I mean, there are all sorts of things that could happen to keep him out of prison. But if he doesn't win re-election, I think that we will get accountability, at least in the form of most, if not all of these trials getting through to their conclusion. And that is the accountability that our system promises, as opposed to a result-driven accountability, right? Of seeing him in the jumpsuit. So I think that's all we can hope for. But the fact that it rests on the political issue of whether he's elected or not is frustrating to people. But that's sort of within the system, right? I mean, if we are dumb enough to elect him again, then I don't know that we deserve the accountability. You know what I'm saying? Like,
Right.
that's kind of our choice as a country, our
Right.
choice as a people.
Well, it depends on how you define we, and it depends on how the we defines accountability. You know, the folks that you see out of the Trump rallies, the ones who are saying, yeah, it's time for America to have a dictator. Like, to them, they don't see criminality. They believe the hype that he did nothing wrong, that it's all a witch hunt, it's all rigged, big conspiracy. So America is just so divided that only half of us, or maybe a little more than half of us, seem to really care anymore about what really matters.
No, I agree. The problem is, you can't expect one piece of this puzzle, the justice system, to, I don't know, to be able to foresee and take care of all of these other problems, like this disinformation that we have in the era of social media, right? And the fact that the Trump base doesn't listen to facts and doesn't understand what's really happening in the real world. And, the justice system can't account for all of that. Like, I feel like the institution of the court system and prosecutors and so on, I don't know, like, it wasn't put together with all of these understandings that we're now facing. And you can't expect it to deal with that. I mean, I think it's rational to think, if you were the founding fathers, the country would never elect someone like this who is facing these kinds of charges in the criminal justice system. So we don't really have to worry about whether the people are going to elect someone like that. That's not what we're thinking about as we kind of craft the justice system and the separation of power structure and all of that. I mean, no one of our institutions really can account for all of those different things, which is, I guess, frustrating, but it's kind of how it is. So as you think about the issue of whether the justice system is doing what it's designed to do, I think it is. The problem is we've got all these other things out there that are hampering us. But those are kind of different problems. I mean, I think it is working as it's supposed to work, albeit with delays. And we can talk, if you want, about the reasons for those delays. Some of those are because of Trump himself. Some of them are because of the office, that he held and that unique issue that the justice system is facing.
I think you're right that it's unrealistic and also unfair for us to look to the judicial system as our savior. And the founding fathers put impeachment, they put certain clauses into the Constitution to protect against somebody who they probably could never have imagined ever getting into the office. And then we saw with impeachment how we had a Congress, a co-equal branch of government, the checks and balances thing didn't work because that branch of government was completely co-opted for Trump. And that's why I think so many people are looking to the judicial system, because Congress has just been inept. But, in terms of accountability, let's start with this New York State civil fraud trial, because I've always believed that the way Trump is going to go down, just like the way Capone went down on taxes and money, Trump's going to go down on money. And for me, accountability for Trump, I relish the idea more of him being broke than being in an orange jumpsuit. And that's how I do think he's going to go down. Now, he's 3 days away from Armageddon. What do you think is going to happen by Monday?
Yeah,
Well-
this is so interesting, these developments. Not much on Monday, except we will know by then whether the appellate division has intervened in any way, if they're trying to sort out some of these issues about what he's actually done to secure this bond, and whether there's any intermediate amount between $100 billion bond, which he apparently says he thinks he can do, and the whole amount, which he says he can't. And we'll also know, I think, on Monday, if the appellate division has not stepped in, what Tish James is planning to do, because she has said that's when she is ready to start taking steps to start seizing assets and so on. And so I expect she'll make an announcement if the court hasn't spoken. But there are a lot of interesting questions. They're battling back and forth on procedural things about whether he's allowed to say this stuff in his reply brief and, all sorts of nonsense like that. But at the end of the day, he's saying, well, listen, I'm not going to tell you much about what the negotiations were or what I offered up as collateral or, what they said back, but we just can't do it. We went to 30 places. We can't find anyone to underwrite this bond. And so I think there is a space for, and I assume the court will speak, the notion that all of this is happening out there and they're just going to sit on it seems crazy. So I think that something will happen. But there's space for someone to come in and be like, all right, well, let's step back. Who did you talk to? What did you offer? How much equity is there in these properties that you're offering up? Like, let's come to some solution where, you can go through the appeal process without having things actually taken from you yet. And yet we need to be comfortable that the state of New York will be paid at the end of all of this, whatever amount it is that's upheld, whether it's the full amount or something else. So I think they'll come to some resolution here. But, maybe the most interesting part is not really the legal part, but the political part, because he's, of course, panicking about this, what I guess newly uncovered notion that he's not as rich as he says he is, that his properties are pretty well leveraged already, and he doesn't have enough cash to cover this. So that's a whole, political thing. He doesn't like that appearance for sure. But legally, not that much is going to happen. I think there'll be a resolution, even if she said on Monday, I'm starting to seize stuff, she could freeze the bank accounts fairly easily, which actually is a whole separate question in itself. Interesting what he would do in terms of kind of short-term cash flow if all of his bank accounts are frozen. But taking and selling real estate, even if she moved to do that, that takes time. That's a whole legal process in and of itself. So the people hoping that sheriffs are showing up to put a big padlock on Trump Tower on Monday morning are going to be disappointed.
Tisch Tower.
But yes, Tisch Tower. But it's interesting in how it kind of, it's like the emperor with no clothes, right? How it discloses this man who's, oh, I'm so rich. And I mean, someone said on X, former Twitter, like, remember when he said he was going to finance his own campaign? Like, no one even had to donate to him because he's so rich, and therefore he never could be influenced by anyone because he has all the money in the world. And, now he's out there like, Tish James is trying to take Trump Tower. Give me $5. So, it's not what it was said to be back in the day. But that's kind of the more interesting part. I think legally, ultimately something will happen. They'll accept some compilation of bonds, or, the court will take possession in a way of the real estate titles so that the state gets paid. That I think will work itself out.
So I want to ask you about all this because guys like me, people on the street, we sometimes think that there's two systems of justice, one for the super wealthy and one for everybody else. People like me are on the outside looking into the system. You've been on the inside. So does it work that way? Like if just some, accountant who was in a similar situation, would someone like that be treated the same that Trump is being treated?
I think in this particular piece of it, the bond thing, I mean, when you're talking about a bond of this size, it's kind of a rarefied class of defendants, right? So you're talking about massive corporations and people with a lot of money who've been sued in class actions or otherwise for tons of money, right? I don't think the treatment here is different from that. That's a huge amount of money. It's hard to bond that. So I don't think that it's such a stark difference in treatment there. More generally, definitely he's being treated differently without question. But it's complicated as to why, I think. Part of it is his practice, as we were talking about a few minutes ago, about this kind of scorched earth, litigate everything to death. Anyone who does that, you're going to treat them a little differently if you're a prosecutor or a plaintiff because you have to. Also, someone who's so high profile, everything that happens is going to be in the press. That makes you kind of a bit more careful. You want to make sure not to make mistakes and so on. And you see people bending over backwards a little more for those people. Part of it, though, is the status of being the former president as well. I mean, again, you have to be extra careful. You want to be really sure that everything is solid and so on. But it also gives him some arguments that other people don't have, right? We're up at the Supreme Court currently with a presidential immunity argument. That's an argument nobody else gets to make. So he is treated differently, but it's kind of a combination of reasons. Judge Cannon we can talk about separately and why she seems to be trying to help him. But otherwise, I think judges and prosecutors are doing their best to try to treat him as they would treat any other litigant, but understanding that it is different because of the scrutiny and the team he has and the way that they're treating it. But I think most of them, Judge Cannon aside, are doing their best to treat him the same way. It's just very challenging.
Is the option of going nuclear, of him filing for bankruptcy, does that save him in any way, or is it just kick the can down the road?
So as I understand it, and bankruptcy is not my area, but as I understand it, bankruptcy does not, you can't discharge in bankruptcy a debt that's based on a fraud finding like this one is. So as I understand it, it doesn't discharge the debt. So you think about bankruptcy as the reason that you do it is you get this clean slate, right? You get to declare bankruptcy and you have to give in all of your assets and then they'll divvy them up among all of your creditors. But then after that process, all of your debts go away, right? Apparently that's not the case with judgments like this one. This question also came up for Rudy Giuliani after he got slammed with that big lawsuit victory from the women who he had defamed the election workers. So this won't be discharged. So if he goes into bankruptcy, they would take the assets, pay the creditors. The bankruptcy court oversees that process, but then this debt would still be sitting there, whatever portion of it wasn't paid during the bankruptcy process. So I don't know if that, I think it's an unattractive prospect for him, certainly politically, to do that. I don't know whether it makes sense financially. He also has coming down the pike, although they may be put on hold, at least to some extent, because of the criminal trials, but he also has a series of lawsuits around January 6th.
Right.
Lawsuits brought by members of Congress and the cops. So we may not be done with multi-million-dollar judgments against him, although those may not play out in the next few months. But he may still have more stuff coming. So, yeah, I don't know. Apparently, though, this one will not go away with bankruptcy. So obviously that's factoring into his whatever discussions he's having with his lawyers about that possibility.
And why do you think that these 30 institutions declined to provide him the funding for the bond? Claire McCaskill said the idea that no one will take his real estate as collateral ought to tell you something about whether or not he overvalued his real estate or not. It's an interesting question, but also, is he too over-leveraged?
Yeah, I don't know. Well, one of the things that the Attorney General has said is that there wasn't enough transparency around these negotiations. So he says, we went to 30 places, none of them would give me the money, but no one knows what he offered them. Presumably, if he offered them enough to cover what they were putting out for the bond, then they would have done it, right? Why not? If it's a secure thing, you get like 2% of the amount as your fee, which is, I think it's like $18 million or something. So why wouldn't a company take that if it's not risky, right? So one of the problems is we just don't know what those negotiations were, what was offered. I mean, some companies apparently don't want to take real estate at all for these things. They want liquid cash or, securities that can be turned into cash. So some of them may have had a policy that precluded whatever he was able to offer in terms of real estate. But some of them, obviously, Chubb, they were negotiating with Chubb up until he filed his motion. So some of them were at least willing to talk about real estate. But a lot of his real estate is already leveraged. So if you're sitting down at that table, you're like, all right, what do you got? He's got, I got this property. Okay, but how much of it is yours?
Right.
20%? Who else has the rest of it? That's not helpful. So we don't know. I think if the court comes in, one of the things they're going to have to figure out is what realistically could he get for bonds. And finding that out they're going to have to kind of go under what they said in that brief that they filed in the affidavits and really find out what was offered and whether they offered everything they had or they just offered a subset and then wanted to go to the court and say, nope, we can't do it. Give us $100 million bond instead of 450. So the court will have to figure that out, I think.
Mm-hmm. No, it's interesting because, like you said before, this whole myth of how wealthy or not he really is. You're right. Like, his business, he's not really a builder. He's a licensor. And, how many properties he actually owns or owns outright. So how much does he have to put up is really such an interesting question,
Yeah, I mean, some investigative reporters and people are much better versed in this, but I think that's right. He wasn't particularly that successful in terms of making money until he became a television personality, and then his name was worth something, right? So he started kind of licensing everything. So that's really where this wealth came from, is Trump this, Trump that, put your name on stuff.
Most of which went bankrupt, by the way. So
right, not the development stuff, but yeah, I think we'll see. I have to think there's ultimately some sort of middle road here where they take $200 million bonds or something, or something like that, because it's the state of New York. I mean, realistically, it's not an individual plaintiff who actually lost $450 million and needs to be made whole.
Right.
So as the court thinks through these things, would it be a tragedy if at the end the state of New York only recovered $300 million instead of $450? I mean, so these are the sorts of things I think the court will say, let's kind of reach some sort of.
You think he can win an appeal in this judgment?
Well, that's a very interesting question, because so much of what the Judge Engoron decided, it's not a science, right? When he decides what the ill-gotten gains are and what the valuations are, and so I don't know what a court will do. I wouldn't be surprised to see a haircut on the amount, because it is awfully high. And again, you have Trump numbers here way up in the sky, crazy numbers. You have the other numbers down here. Judge Engoron is closer to the state's numbers than his numbers. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised to see a haircut. But that's what's interesting about that whole issue is here we are talking about a bond. They don't know, and they're not thinking ahead to the merits at all. But think about how unfair really it would be if this whole thing is overturned, right? Like, let's say he has to post all of this, he has to sell a piece of real estate, and then in the end they're like, oh, sorry, he made some mistakes of law, and this whole thing, never mind, and it goes away. So it's I don't know. It's an interesting question, but I think probably, to the extent I want to try to do a crystal ball thing, I think probably the judgment gets upheld, but I wouldn't be surprised to see a haircut on the amount, which is very high.
So let's talk about the Supreme Court, absolute immunity. The two biggest questions, obviously, are A, why did they take this case? And B, now that they took it, what the hell are they going to do with it?
So many people thought that they should not have taken it. The D.C. Circuit did a very good job, wrote a very powerful opinion, and I think that they got it right. And I think that they obviously are at least some number of justices who thought that they got it right and they could just leave it in place, which is what they normally do when a circuit court gets it right. There are, though, legitimate reasons for the Supreme Court to speak on this because of what it is. It's a constitutional issue about the presidency that the Supreme Court is obviously the final word on. I hope we never are in a situation again where we are criminally charging a former president for actions he took while he was president. But if we were, the D.C. Circuit's opinion on presidential immunity only governs in the D.C. Circuit. So you need the Supreme Court to be the final word if you want that ruling to cover the entire country. So I think those reasons around it's really the Supreme Court's job to do this way it covers the whole country for the future, those are good reasons to take it. The only problem with taking it, of course, is the timing of the trial. I mean, if we didn't have this trial coming up, or if the election was not in 24 but was in 26, everyone would say, of course the Supreme Court should take it. Who cares? Of course they should. They'll decide it in the normal course and we'll all be fine. So it's really just the timing of the trial that is causing anyone to say, how dare they take it? And honestly, if you're the Supreme Court, I'm not sure that that's your job to think about the trial schedule per se, right? I mean, there are all sorts of reasons you can say why this didn't go to trial sooner, some having to do with Trump and his litigation and delay strategies, some having to do with what Merrick Garland and his team did to investigate before they appointed Jack Smith. I don't think anyone could say Jack Smith didn't move with speed once he was appointed, but there are all sorts of reasons why the trial was not already underway, or it wasn't further along, I guess, earlier than it was. And I'm not sure it's the Supreme Court's job to say, well, you guys are in a panic because of the trial date vis-a-vis the election. That's not really our problem. Like, that's not our issue to think about. So I'm not sure it's their job to, say, we're not going to take it because if we do, it's going to screw up the trial date.
But should they be taking 2 months to hold a hearing?
They could do it sooner, of course.
I mean, they showed us with the 14th Amendment. They did that in 4 weeks. Why did they need 8 weeks?
They did, although that is a little tighter on the time, right? They have actual primaries coming up where people will be voting, and people ought to know whether they can vote for Trump and whether that vote will count.
But just to play devil's advocate, then they're thinking politically, right? They're thinking with an eye on the election. So what would be the difference with November?
Okay, so let's say Bush v. Gore then, right? Like an instance where you actually have an election issue, you have to decide it quickly because dates are coming up that you have to have a decision for. That's the 14th Amendment situation more so than this situation, because there's no reason that this has to be decided before the election legally, right? Because a convicted felon can be the president. I mean, there's no legal bar to that. So the only reason people want the Supreme Court to resolve this in enough time to allow the trial to happen is because they think that voters will be impacted by their ruling, right? The ruling of the jury. And that's not really a legal issue related to timing that the Supreme Court is supposed to be thinking about, I think. At least that's the argument, and I think that it has some merit.
By the way,
I wish that they had said no. Like, I wish they had let the D.C. Circuit stay in place. And I wish that they had said, we're going to hear it in a week. You've made all your arguments anyway. There's no reason to delay this. I mean, I do wish they had done that. I do want to see this tried before the election. But I think it's a bit unfair to criticize them for not moving more swiftly. I think it has important differences from the other things we've talked about, like the 14th Amendment issue.
By the way, isn't it kind of crazy that you could be a convicted felon sitting in a jail cell and you cannot vote for president, but you could be a convicted felon sitting in a jail cell and you can be president?
Yeah.
That's kind of a serious flaw in our system, isn't it?
It's so interesting. So remember when Trump refused to turn over his taxes, and some states like California passed a law that said, I need to be on our ballot. You have to have disclosed your tax returns. And that did not hold up because in the Constitution, it lists the qualifications for the president, and no state is allowed to add to those qualifications for president, right? You just think about the founders thinking about, well, what qualifications do we want someone to have to be the president? And I guess they just didn't decide that a clean criminal record was one of, and you can see why, right? Like, what if you got a disorderly conduct for getting in a bar fight when you were in college? I mean, you can see why they don't want to make a blanket statement about disqualifying someone, because then you're like, okay, now we're talking about maybe it's just felonies, maybe it's just violent felonies, maybe, how do you kind of parse that out to say this person can't be the president? So when you really kind of start digging into it, you can, I guess, see why they didn't do it that way, but it does seem kind of crazy. As you say, you can't vote when you're in prison, and in a lot of states, you can't vote when you're out of prison if you're a convicted felon.
But you can be president.
And we may see one.
Yeah,
next year.
And so what do you think is going to happen? Is there any way that the Supreme Court could say, yeah, sure, absolute immunity?
No, I don't think so. I mean, I think the problem is you have a couple of justices who do seem to try to help the right-wing cause, right, kind of politically, ideologically. And then you also have some justices who have a very strong view that the executive should be very powerful, right? These folks who are big into executive power, like Kavanaugh, for one. And so I can see debates around wanting to protect the executive, making decisions that could, in retrospect, be viewed as bad decisions, and wanting to protect a president from prosecution for some of those decisions. So people talk about like the Obama raid on killing of Osama bin Laden, or drone strikes that presidents order, or really anything in the kind of terrorism fight, war realm. You know, there are all sorts of decisions presidents make that kill people. And so what if an attention-seeking young district attorney somewhere decided that they wanted to go to a grand jury and charge a former president for some of those actions? You could see that a president ought to be criminally immune, right? You ought to be immune from prosecutions from decisions that you make like that.
Sure.
So there's going to be, you know, there would be some immunity, I think, unquestionably, somewhere along the line. But there is a line to be drawn, and it's not where he wants to draw it, which is that essentially anything that I do while I was sitting behind the desk, right, while I had the title of president until I was out of office, I should be completely immune. I don't think any of the justices are going to buy that. The question is, where are they going to try to draw that line? And, you know, I think his team, understanding that they're not going to get a literal blanket of anything, they're trying to characterize the things that he's charged with doing as official acts that would be covered by any immunity. And for the most part, I think the justices are going to have to acknowledge that what he's charged with is not official acts, right? But it's not clear that it's all that way. So, for example, the part of the scheme that had him potentially installing Jeff Clark as the head of the Department of Justice so that they could come out and falsely say that they were concerned about fraud and they were investigating fraud and the legislature should take action because there was all this voting fraud. You know, the president's oversight of the Department of Justice, broadly speaking, is part of his job. And so that might be a part of the indictment and some of the allegations that a person who believes in a strong executive with a lot of executive power might say that should be within the kind of official act gambit that should garner presidential immunity after the fact. But then there's a lot of other things like find me the votes and trying to pressure legislatures, and of course the fake slates of electors, which really can't be cast in any way as part of the job of president that he clearly did as part of his presidential candidate role, right? Trying to win re-election or steal the election more accurately. And so I think that ultimately the court is going to have to say that there are enough allegations. Most of the allegations in the indictment are clearly allegations of things that he did outside of the president's job, right? That were done as things for his personal benefit or his personal political benefit as a candidate and not as the president. But what's going to be really interesting is how they kind of phrase that, where they draw that line, how clear the guidance is that they give for what falls on what side of the line. But there's no way they're going to say, for the famous example that came up at the DC Circuit argument, that he could order an assassination of his political rival by SEAL Team 6 and, get away with that.
So just the fact that lawyers walked into court and argued that shows you where we are in our country today. And it shows you the strain put on the judicial system that it has to address that kind of hypothetical. It's insane. Georgia, the election interference case. So much has been going on there. Judge Scott McAfee dismissed 7 of the charges. Then he also ruled on the disqualification of Fani Willis. What do you think is ultimately going to happen there? Because to me, there's the one place where there's the RICO situation, to me, is a real existential crisis for Trump because of the mandatory 5-year prison sentence.
So I don't know what's going to happen in Georgia. I haven't practiced in Georgia, but it's not happening this year. I mean, that I think is for sure. Partly because they charged 18 people. The Jack Smith, he did charge other people in the classified documents piece, just on the obstruction part of it, but not on the January 6th part. And that was very purposeful. I mean, they identified 6 or 7 unindicted co-conspirators who, in theory, could have been charged. That's what being an unindicted co-conspirator means, that you're legally liable, you could be charged. And they didn't because they wanted to get this to trial. Fani Willis did it a different way. charging 18 people. I think 14 of them are still in the case. So there's no way it's happening this year. I don't know what's happening with it at all. I mean, if she's disqualified, it's now on appeal to the Court of Appeals in Georgia. If she's disqualified, then I don't know that we'll ever see it. I also read that the 5-year mandatory minimum is not really mandatory in Georgia.
Really?
So that, yeah.
You just ruined my day.
That it's, I know. I'll have to look into it more and get back to you with more details. But I did read that everyone's saying, like, he's going to prison for 5 years if he's convicted is not necessarily true. But we have a long road to get there is, you know, the first thing. I mean, the notion that they could have gone to trial in August, even before this sideshow about Bonnie Willis and her romance with Nathan Wade, seemed crazy to me. In a big RICO case that you can't go with 14 people. You have to get rid of at least half of those. And then, you know, between all of the pretrial stuff and jury selection and, you know, it just was never going to be possible. So, you know, we'll see. I mean, this one is really going to depend. I think it'll go to trial eventually if he is not reelected. But I don't know when. And it may be that it's last in line and it gets kind of overtaken by other events. I mean, if he's convicted in the federal case first, you know, I don't know that they even bother with the Georgia state case as to him. I mean, they've charged all these other people. They could proceed with them, but I don't know. I'm kind of putting Georgia on the back burner. I think that there's much more urgency with the other 3 cases. I don't know.
Do you think Giuliani and Meadows ultimately face the music in Georgia?
Well, I don't see why not. I mean, all of everything people are talking about with respect to getting it done before the election and then what happens if Trump wins the election, that only applies to him.
Right.
So if Trump wins re-election, you know, one of the first things he does when he takes office, of course, is has the federal cases dismissed, and then runs into court in Georgia and says, hi, I'm the president. You can't prosecute me while I'm the president. And so they have to dismiss him out of that case. But that still leaves all of these other defendants. I mean, there's no reason why the rest of the case wouldn't go forward. None of those other people is the president, right? So they can't claim that same privilege of not being prosecuted while Donald Trump is in office. And of course, he doesn't have pardon power over state prosecutions, so he can't pardon them either.
You have Cohen, you have Navarro, you have Meadows, you have Giuliani. Like it just seems like if there's a scenario where ultimately all these people end up going to prison except him. Just there's
for
something not right there, you know.
Steve Bannon, and then Bannon's coming up. He's got a sentence pending on the obstruction of Congress, but then he also has his Build the Wall case, the state case in Manhattan that's scheduled for trial in May. Yeah, lots of people have gone to prison. I mean, some of them, like Cohen, of course, did plead to the campaign finance crime with Trump, but also a lot of other things that didn't involve Trump. So he went to prison. I guess a small part was because of Trump, but not all of it. But certainly a lot of people have gotten themselves into trouble, including people like Giuliani on the legal front. Like he's been suspended from practice because of what he did for Trump, and Cohen was disbarred. So lots of consequences.
So let's talk about the circus down in Florida, Judge Aileen Cannon, which, I mean, the only way to really describe it is that it's just an absolute shit show. She has no idea what she's doing. She's woefully incompetent. And then she's clearly partisan. It's just a mess.
This was some really, really bad luck from the wheel that they get. You know, you wheel out the judge when a case comes in. So she had the special master issue after the Mar-a-Lago search. He sued, saying, you know, you can't, the FBI can't look at these documents. They shouldn't be investigating these. These are my documents. And so she appointed a special master who had to go through all of the documents and decide what could be turned over to prosecutors. That process took months. And she was so inept during that process and made rulings that were so biased for Trump, just bad rulings, that she was twice reversed in very harsh language by the 11th Circuit. So everyone kind of knew Judge Eileen Cannon was either incompetent or in the bag for Trump or some combination of those two things. And then she was wheeled out the classified documents case when it was actually filed, which, assuming they did it the right way, was just really, really terrible luck for the special counsel. And so she since has persisted in being a combination of incompetent and in the bag for Trump. And it's hard to tell which one is more the case. So when you say she's incompetent and she makes really bad rulings and she doesn't seem to know what she's doing, I agree, but I don't know if she really just doesn't know what she's doing or she understands that her taking more time with things and asking the parties for more argument, more clarification, and ruling terrible things that then have to be, then the special counsel has to come back and ask for her to reconsider, and then she has to reverse them. And, she understands as well as anyone does the timing issues. And this case, there was no reason that this case couldn't be well done before the trial. I mean, what she said at trial date of May, that was a pretty leisurely trial date at the time. And so I think she has been purposely slow walking this thing from day one, knowing that this way, if she does it this way, instead of just making egregiously bad rulings that get appealed and reversed, no judges hate to be reversed. They hate to be reversed, right? This way, she gets to just slow walk it and say, oh, we don't have time to try it in front of the election. How sad. Let's move it to 2025, right? And no one could say that she did that purposely or that she made a bad ruling and get reversed. So that, I think, has been much of the problem, is that the slow walking has led to a situation where we can't get this thing tried. And so it's hard to tell, what's really happening here. We are now at a place with these crazy rulings about, give me jury instructions about the Presidential Records Act that assumes that he has powers that no reasonably smart person thinks that he could possibly have. I mean, these really, really crazy arguments she seems to be accepting. And so it may now be time finally for the special counsel to ask for her to be replaced, to appeal and say she needs to be replaced. Because now the concern is, and I don't think many people had this concern at the outset. I think everyone thought, oh, she might just make terrible rulings. She might slow walk it. Now people are saying, if she actually tries this case and then instructs the jury in a completely batshit crazy way, right, that causes them to acquit him, then it's all over. If you get an acquittal at trial, double jeopardy has attached. There is no appealing that.
Right.
No matter how crazy the judge was, no matter how much the judge was, in the bag for Trump or whatever. So now there's this concern that, she's not just slow walking, that she may actually walk this thing right into an acquittal. And so maybe it's time for, based on a variety of terrible rulings, including her ruling that the witnesses should be publicly disclosed, which there's zero reason for. I mean, if the defendant has the identity of the witnesses, there's no good reason for the public to need to have them, especially in a scenario when he goes out and publicly bashes witnesses and they get death threats and have their lives turned upside down. So there's a whole slew of things that Smith could appeal and say, listen, she needs to be replaced. The risks with that are that means 100% it's not happening before the election. And number two, judges hate to disparage each other. I mean, they have been very harsh on her. They were very harsh on her on those special master rulings. I think they would overturn her on these terrible rulings that she's making, but to replace her basically admits that she is some combination of incompetent or completely biased, and judges don't like to do that to each other. So, I think they have viewed that as a very much a last resort, understanding that it's a long shot. And, if you try to get a judge removed and you fail, then, they're even more mad at you than they may have been before. So, but it's really a travesty what's been happening down there. And from day one, many people, and myself included, were like, this is not This is never going to happen in the way it should. Like this is not going to end well for Team Justice, because she just has shown that she can't be fair, or she's, not capable enough to shepherd this through the way it should be done. If people talk about how complicated it is, it's not that complicated. It's not that complicated. I did terrorism cases, the Classified Information Procedures Act. There are things you have to do. It's not rocket science. And you have very capable lawyers on the government side to tell you, kind of how this all works. And, Trump has not been able to attract really great legal talent, but he has some good lawyers who can stand up on the other side, including 2 former federal prosecutors. Well, more than 2 who worked with me. And he's got a couple more than that, I think, on his team. So they can get this done. It's not.
But what's interesting, though, is if we now say, okay, what have we been discussing so far? You talk about Georgia, you talk about Florida, you talk about the Supreme Court, the 14th Amendment, this, that, the other thing. It does start to feel like he's dodging bullets, like he is Teflon, and this dovetails into my last question to you, which is about the New York hush money case. A lot of people talk about, this is such an insignificant thing. I don't even know why it's being brought. I wish it wasn't going first, blah, blah, blah. But it actually is going to be the case where probably by the end of May or so, Donald Trump will be, in my opinion, a convicted felon, right? And it seems like a much more important case to me than a lot of people make it out to be, because if you look at Jack Smith's case, that's a federal election interference case. To me, Alvin Bragg's case is a state election interference case. Where do you stand on the significance of that case?
Well, I think it is the least serious of the 4 cases, without question, because it does charge interference with the 2016 election, but not in the same way that he's charged with the 2020 election, right? He didn't mobilize a mob. He didn't, oversee this vast conspiracy that had all these different strands trying to do different things. He had sex with a porn star years and years before. And then in the lead up to the election, after the Access Hollywood tape broke, and they were worried about whether he could possibly win or not, and women were going to hate him, Stormy Daniels kind of surfaces and said, hey, I'm going to tell everybody about our fling. And he, pays her money, right? He pays her off to be quiet. So did he do that because the election was looming and they were worried about the impact? Absolutely, 100%. So I think it's serious in that sense. I think Alvin's team has been smart to kind of push that part of it, that spin on it, out into the public. I think that's the emphasis that they want to make, as opposed to this notion of, well, businesses in New York should really, they should do their books the right way. And if they lie, it's terrible. And, I don't think people care as much about that. So I think it's a case that was worth bringing. I think it's a serious case. I don't think it compares to the others in its seriousness. But I agree with you. I think it's a serious enough case that people will care, and I think he will likely get a conviction on it. And I think he should. I think they should get a conviction on it. There are some appeal issues here, legal issues around whether you can use a federal crime to make this a felony instead of a misdemeanor. Those are issues for appeal, so they don't factor in at the trial level. But when you think about, how important is this case? Is he going to go to prison for this? The answer is no. Even if they convict him of the felony, I think he won't go to prison for this. So in that sense, also, it's less serious. But it's a crime. It's something he did to try to improve his chances of winning the election. And I'm glad it's going to get to go to trial, luckily, because it's not federal and it happened before he became president. I mean, this is what makes it cleaner to bring it than some of these other things that have to deal with immunity and so on. So, we had a little snafu now. We have a little delay, but it seems like it will go in April. I was a bit concerned about Judge Marchand's trial calendar because he has the Steve Bannon Build the Wall case coming up in May. So I think he's hoping to still get this one in before that. But I think it's important, even though there won't be cameras in the courtroom, and even though it doesn't involve classified documents or the 2020 election, that he stand trial and that people see that the system works and he's being judged by a jury of his peers. I mean, he wants to say, oh, those crazy Manhattan liberal juries. he's a Manhattan guy until he moved to Florida recently. You know, he lived in Manhattan, so
Jury of your
these
peers.
are his people.
Yeah. No, it's
Jury of
interesting
your peers.
to come full circle from how we started this conversation. The point you had raised about the accountability being twofold, political and legal. I think this case, when you look at the fact that there have been polls that show that Republicans say, 20 to 30% of them, that they won't vote for him if he's a convicted felon. I think this case might actually impact how people vote in that regard.
It's funny because I think it's almost like usually less information and disinformation works to his advantage. In this case, it's almost flipped because I think if you said to people, do you care that he covered up of an affair with a porn star so that people wouldn't hear about it before the election, they might go, in comparison to the other stuff he's done, who cares?
Mm-hmm.
But if you just say, you want a convicted felon being your president, he's a convicted felon, people are like, oh no, that's not good.
Yeah, I think you're right. So we'll see. It'll be interesting. I really appreciate your time. You've been very generous with your time. I do hope you'll come back because it's going to be cray-cray for the next 8 months. And I'm sure these conversations are going to take turns and cases are going to end up in places that we may not even be able to imagine, especially in Florida. So thanks again for coming on.
I'm sure you're right. I'm happy to come back. I look forward to it. Yeah, we'll see what happens.
All righty. Take care, Jennifer.
All right. Thanks. Bye.
This episode of The Back Room was edited and produced by me, Andy Ostroy. It was co-edited and co-produced by Maddie Rosenberg and co-produced by Jen Hammoud. Our theme song was composed by Andrew Hollander, and our logo was designed by Cricket Langell. And special thanks to Patricia Wind. Please take a moment to rate and review the podcast, and also follow or subscribe. Until next time, keep your eyes on Washington, Hollywood, and your own backyards, and have a great week.